Thank you, Knight, for the brief introduction. I'm tempted to go back to 1919 and start this story. But I want to tell an old story that I think at this time is worth retelling. And it goes way back to September 8th, 1974, Sunday. Gerald Ford was president. Nixon had resigned 30 days earlier. And on that Sunday, Ford went on television very early announcing he was giving Nixon a full pardon for Watergate. I think Ford went on early Sunday morning hoping no one would notice. But it was noticed, but not by me. I was asleep. And my colleague Carl Bernstein called me up and said, "Have you heard?" And I said, "No, I was asleep." And Carl, who then and still has the ability to say what occurred with the fewest words and the most drama, said, "The son of a bitch pardoned the son of a bitch." I felt very good that I was able to decode what Carl had said. And I remember thinking at the moment, it's perfect. Ford gets the presidency, Nixon gets a pardon. I was sure it was the final corruption of Watergate. That was affirmed, I think, 2 years later when Ford ran against Jimmy Carter, and Carter beat Ford because of the pardon. Really was never explained. There was an aroma about it. So 25 years after the pardon, I undertook one of my book projects, a book called Shadow, about the legacy of Watergate in the presidencies of Ford through Clinton. And I called Ford up. I had never met him, never interviewed him. In the newsroom of the Post, they had a big smiling picture of Jerry Ford that the classified ad department had put up. Remember when newspapers had classified ads? And it was a picture of Ford saying, "I got my job through the Washington Post." Shameless marketing, and finally somebody had the wisdom to take it down. And so I decided for the book Shadow to call Ford. So this is the end of the 90s, 97, 98, and I thought he would not want to talk about the pardon, and I was totally wrong. Jerry Ford turned out to be one of the most honest, forthright person I had ever dealt with in Washington. So in this excursion into history, 25 years after it occurred, I had the luxury of time. I did, in the end, for the book Shadow, and then later, because I went and interviewed Ford some more, did 7 interviews and kept asking the question, what happened? Why did you pardon Nixon? And I remember the last interview in Ford's, at his home in Rancho Mirage, California. He and his wife Betty had a little bungalow there, and we're sitting, tape recorder on the desk for history. And I again asked, "Why did you pardon Nixon?" He said, "Well, you keep asking that question." And I said, "I just don't think you've answered it." And to my surprise, he said, "You're right. I've never told the full story. I never even told Betty." And then opened a monologue, which it was almost kind of a mind entry for Ford, explaining what had happened. And he said, I never wanted to be president, wanted to be Speaker of the House, but Spiro Agnew resigned, so Nixon picked me as vice president. And then this Watergate kept growing, and on August 1st, 1974, as vice president, Al Haig came to see Ford, Haig being Nixon's chief of staff, and Haig and Ford had talked about this meeting and fudged it up, of course, and Ford said what really happened in that meeting is Al Haig said, look, if you agree to pardon Nixon, he'll resign and you get the presidency. I'm sitting there and it's on the tape. I said, holy shit. There was a deal. And Ford, you can hear his hand on the tape, said there was no deal. And then he said, let me take you through what happened. Yes, Haig came and he offered a deal. I could never tell this because then there'd be more investigations. Haig would deny it. But he said, I rejected that deal because it would be corrupt. And let me take you to the world I was living in, Ford said. And then it was a very kind of unburdening of what it's like to be at the perch in the presidency. And he said, so he becomes president, and everything was about Nixon. What about Nixon's tapes? Is Kissinger going to come? I remember Ford said, he said, as president, I had to deal with Kissinger every day coming in saying, Mr. President, the world is going to blow up unless you take my advice. The economy was in trouble. Ford said he had a letter from the special prosecutor saying that Nixon was going to be investigated as a private citizen. So Ford said we're going to have 2 or 3 more years of Watergate. The country could not stand it. He said in this plaintive voice, I needed my own presidency. Where was the off switch for Nixon? The pardon. Constitution gave him the power to pardon anyone. It's unreviewable. And he said, so I acted and pardoned Nixon, but it wasn't corrupt. I was not taking a deal. And he said, now remember, at this point, Nixon's final tapes were coming out, and Nixon was finished. If it was a deal, I was going to get my end of the bargain. But it was not a deal. I had to, from that perch of the presidency, ask the question, what's the national interest? And I had to act on it. And he said, I knew in pardoning Nixon, I was finished in politics, but I had to do it for that larger interest. In Shadow, I wrote about how instead of it being corrupt, what Ford did was actually quite gutsy. After the book came out, Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of John F. Kennedy, called me up and said she and her uncle, Teddy Kennedy, had read this and agreed and that it was gutsy. And she said, we're going to give the Profiles in Courage Award that's given each year from the Kennedy Library to somebody in politics who does what the 8 senators in her late father, John F. Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage, did, where they essentially self-sabotaged their own career in the interest of the country, in the national interest. So they gave this ceremony, gave this award to Ford. I did not go, but it was videoed. And I distinctly remember watching this. And Ford somewhat vindicated Teddy Kennedy, saying at the time I said the pardon was almost a crime, but I now realize I was wrong. This was a courageous act in the tradition of my late brother's book, Profiles in Courage. So I'm watching this, Ford's somewhat vindicated, and what a cold shower to look at this, because I, in 1974, would have staked my life that this was corrupt. And then you relook at it 25 years later through the lens of history, and what I was sure was corrupt turns out to be the opposite: courage, humbling, humiliating, and to be so wrong. And so the lesson, I think, is we're never sure. There's always more reporting to do, and that maybe we, like I did at that time, have it completely wrong and upside down. So now, I believe at this time, the issue of what's the national interest? Where is it? Who can express it? Who can believe in it? And where does it reside? And of course, that's our job in the media, and to do more reporting, not jump to the conclusion of the moment and say, this is what it is, because so easy, so often, we have it not just wrong, but sometimes upside down. Thank you very much.